Okay, let's unpack this immediately because the sources for this deep dive are, I mean, they're not just historical documents, are they? They feel more like psychological evidence of a whole civilization.
That's a great way to put it. We're absolutely dealing with something far more complex than just, simple violence.
Right. If your perception of Roman entertainment is based on those cinematic scenes, the noble gladiators fighting for honor.
The Hollywood version.
Yeah, exactly. Then you are about to encounter the unfiltered bureaucratic truth of an industrialized atrocity.
And we have to be clear, we're talking about systematic cruelty that was mandated by the state. It was documented by the people who witnessed it. Figures like the poet Martial, the philosopher Seneca, the moralist Tertullian. This wasn't some kind of cultural blind spot.
No, it was policy.
It was absolutely policy.
And the most shocking example of that policy, I think, well, we have to start right at the top, the inauguration day of the Colosseum. I mean, this is the most famous structure of that whole era, and it's packed. 50,000 citizens. You've got senators, merchants, children, mothers, everyone. And they're all waiting for this grand display of imperial power.
And the poet Martial was there. He captured the moment perfectly, documenting a staged mythological reenactment, the myth of Pasiphae.
Okay, before we get to the horror of what happened, maybe you should walk us through the actual myth, because the perversion of it is the whole point.
Right. So in Greek mythology, Pasiphae was the wife of King Minos of Crete. Now, because of a divine curse, she develops this unnatural desire for a magnificent white bull.
Right.
To fulfill this desire, the famous craftsman Daedalus constructs a hollow mechanical cow, a very realistic one. Pasiphae is able to conceal herself inside it, and she then mates with the bull.
And this act leads to the birth of the Minotaur.
Precisely. That's the myth.
So now, let's fast forward. We're in the center of the brand new Colosseum in Rome. The audience, all 50,000 of them, they know this myth. They understand the transgression of the forbidden union.
And Martial recorded exactly what happened next. A terrified, condemned woman was forced inside a massive hollow wooden construct that was shaped like a cow.
Oh, wow.
And then a bull was led into the arena and was goaded into mounting the mechanical device. It was performing the execution and the violation at the same time.
It's execution disguised as theater.
Its sexual humiliation turned into a state-sanctioned performance, and it was viewed by 50,000 people. And Martial, he records this with this chilling, almost triumphant tone. He wrote, "We saw Pasiphae united with the bull. The ancient legend received testimony under Caesar."
So the crowd wasn't just passively watching this happen.
No, they roared their approval.
Yeah.
They were cementing their complicity in the state's absolute power.
That one anecdote just strips away every single layer of romanticism about the Roman games. The reality, as you said, it wasn't chaos. It was meticulously planned bureaucracy. All of it designed for control and, I guess, mass desensitization.
That's exactly it.
So the mission of this deep dive is to really understand the administrative machine that was required to pull off cruelty on this industrial scale.
And the scale itself really sets the stakes. We are not talking about a few local fights here and there.
No.
The historian Utopia did a calculation of the total cost of this obsession. And the number is it's hard to grasp. 400,000 deaths across 4 centuries.
400,000.
In over 250 amphitheaters scattered across the entire empire, from Britain all the way down to North Africa.
And these are not deaths from war or plague or some natural disaster. These were people meticulously budgeted for, transported, scheduled, and then killed in the sand, solely for applause.
For entertainment.
So let's examine the machine that made that number possible. Let's start with that administrative scope.
Okay.
When we call this industrialized, what we really mean is that death wasn't just a disorganized event. It was, it was a logistical masterpiece.
It truly was. It's the perfect application of Roman efficiency, but applied to human destruction. It's chilling.
The organization required for these spectacles to function every single day, sometimes for months on end. It's just staggering to think about.
Well, take Emperor Titus's inaugural games, the ones we just mentioned. They lasted for 100 consecutive days.
100 days straight.
100 days. You simply cannot improvise that. This was a massive government undertaking with a budget and a schedule.
It was policy. It required specialized state architects who were designing things like underground mechanical lifts, the hismata and complex hydraulic systems and all those holding cages beneath the arena floor.
And you needed logistics specialists, you needed administrative clerks who were tracking inventory of both people and animals, and you even needed veterinary staff to make sure the animals were alive.
And often starved.
And often starved, yes.
Yeah.
Just long enough to enter the arena and perform their function.
The flawless execution of the schedule itself must have been a form of power projection.
Absolutely. It was a demonstration of terror. The state was showing that it could manage not only the chaos of a battlefield, but the precise timing of suffering.
And the sheer numbers confirm this. Titus's 100 days, you mentioned. There was the slaughter of 9,000 animals.
9,000. That's a minimum of 90 deaths per day, every single day, without fail. That demands a precision flow of victims and beasts into the arena.
Which means, to maintain that flow, Rome needed an absolutely astonishing supply chain, what we could call a logistical mastery over the entire natural world.
Yeah, the nightmare of the Venationes supply line. Think about the geographic reach that was required for this.
It's basically the whole known world.
Pretty much. The demand for novelty and for scale forced Rome to establish an empire-wide infrastructure dedicated just to capturing, transporting, and maintaining exotic beasts.
So where were they getting them from?
All over. Specialized hunters were deployed to North Africa for lions and elephants. Leopards were sourced from the distant Caucasus Mountains. We have records of crocodiles and hippos being captured and shipped all the way up the Nile.
It's just incredible. Even the seemingly impossible, like a giraffe, was dragged across deserts and somehow navigated by ship.
And if you were a handler on this logistical chain, you were risking your life. You're navigating brutal landscapes, dealing with disease, managing unpredictable, terrified wildlife. You're often losing animals and men to the journey itself.
And all of this immense resource expenditure, all that risk, was undertaken for what? So that the few animals that actually survived the journey could be killed in the sand moments after they arrived.
And the bureaucracy wasn't just about movement, it was about maintenance and really psychological conditioning. There was a specialized bureaucracy tracking the animal inventory. Which lions were too old, which ones were vigorous enough.
And they knew how to make them more aggressive.
Critically, yes. Animal trainers knew exactly how to maximize aggression. They would deliberately starve specific creatures to ensure a predictable, frenzied, and spectacular attack for the audience's pleasure.
So the cruelty was engineered right into the supply chain itself, from the moment of capture to the final performance.
Every step of the way.
But if the organization was perfect, the message had to be just as flawless. The real goal here wasn't just simple amusement.
Not at all. It was political control. It was broadcasting imperial power.
The spectacle was a teaching tool.
Absolutely. The victims, whether they were prisoners of war or criminals, were often dressed meticulously as Rome's defeated enemies. Gauls, Dacians, Samnites, various so-called barbarians.
And their inevitable loss in the arena served a clear function.
A very clear function. It visually reinforced the message that Rome's military and political dominance was absolute. It was eternal. The narrative of imperial supremacy was broadcast through every clash of steel and everybody that fell in the sand.
It's a very effective, a very brutal way to establish compliance. The state engineered the whole environment, the loud music, the cheering, the betting, to make all 50,000 citizens complicit in the atrocity.
And when they were placing bets and demanding the ugula, the death blow, they were turning suffering into a shared cultural experience.
They were cementing their connection to the imperial power structure.
They were all in it together, celebrating the same violence.
And that shared complicity came at an extraordinary philosophical and psychological cost, which we see chronicled so vividly by the philosopher Seneca.
Yes. He attended the games, and he documented the corrosive effect that the spectacle had on the soul of the audience.
Seneca was writing during the time of Nero, right? So this was an era where the spectacles were becoming increasingly Baroque.
Extremely. He observed what he called the poison of spectatorship. He recognized that the audience wasn't just being entertained, they were being corrupted. And he wrote that chilling line about the effect the games had on the observer, not just the victims.
It's a profound confession. He wrote, "I come home more greedy, more cruel, more inhuman because I have been among humans."
He understood the difference between watching, say, a gladiatorial combat, which at least had rules and training, and the arbitrary cruelty of the midday executions. He specifically calls those out.
He says gladiators were shielded from the worst, but the midday spectacle was just sheer murder. It's interesting that he mentions that midday show specifically. Why did he find The meridiani, the executions that happened between the morning hunts and the afternoon gladiator fights, why were they more corrupting than the choreographed combat?
Well, because the Meridiani stripped away any pretense of skill or honor. Seneca describes watching men executed in a way that offered absolutely no chance of survival. The only goal was a prolonged, humiliating death.
So he saw men being devoured by lions and bears or simply butchered in the open.
Yes, and the crowd laughed and jeered. Seneca realized that the philosophical elite, by attending these random massacres, were essentially training themselves to find humor in arbitrary suffering.
That's the key analytical nugget, isn't it? The violence didn't stay contained within the arena walls.
Not at all.
The psychological corruption followed the spectators home. It was shrinking their capacity for empathy with every roar of the crowd.
It was a factory for dehumanization. The bureaucracy of death wasn't just killing the victims in the arena, it was systematically dehumanizing the spectators in the stands.
And if the goal of the state was to show that human life held no value outside of its utility to the empire, well, they succeeded.
They absolutely succeeded.
Which suggests that the massive logistical effort we just described was less about military efficiency and more about demonstrating control. Control over the world's resources and control over the very emotions of its citizens.
So if the violence corrupted the masses, what did Rome do when those same masses inevitably grew bored of the same old violence?
That's the question, isn't it? Humans adapt, even to horror. Repetition dulls the blade.
So Rome had to continuously innovate. The goal was to keep the audience teetering on that razor's edge between horror and fascination. If the spectacle became routine, the political control mechanism would fail.
So this led to an arms race of novelty, both with exotic animals and with new forms of human combat.
Their first answer to this hunger for the new was the Venationes, the animal hunts, and these were ramped up from simple hunts into mass executions of nature.
And this demand for exotic novelty drove the empire to become, as Pliny the Elder lamented, an ecological wrecking ball.
Indeed. The animals weren't displayed for some kind of scientific wonder. They were trophies. They were meant to display Rome's global reach. They had to be new, shocking, and preferably killed in a very dramatic fashion.
Which brings us to that infamous first giraffe execution. That was in 46 BC, orchestrated by Julius Caesar himself.
It's such a striking image. This animal was so foreign that the Romans didn't even have a name for it. They had to invent one. Camelopardalis, the camel-leopard hybrid.
So it's just standing there in the sand, utterly bewildered, surrounded by thousands of screaming faces.
And its death was quick, because the purpose wasn't to watch it fight. The purpose was that moment of revelation. It was a message.
A message being?
Rome's dominion extends everywhere, even to the unknown, exotic corners of the globe. Rome could pull something that seemed impossible into its grasp and then immediately terminate it. It was a demonstration of absolute, unparalleled power over nature itself.
And this appetite became insatiable and ruinous. Pliny the Elder, he was an expert on natural history, and he registered a profound complaint about this.
He complained bitterly that rare species, lions, leopards, bears, elephants, even specific types of Asian big cats, were being hunted toward extinction solely because the games demanded a constant supply.
So this wasn't accidental. It was a direct consequence of policy.
It was a deliberate engine of mass death for animals, driven by pure vanity, not by need. We have evidence of logistical teams focusing entirely on bringing rhinoceroses, creatures that are incredibly difficult to transport and maintain, just to provide a single moment of awe for the crowd. It resulted in massive ecological distortion across all of its territories.
That just demonstrates the mountainous cost, not just financially, but to the natural world.
Right.
But okay, animals were only one part of this escalating need for novelty. The crowd also craved the high-stakes uncertainty that only human conflict could provide.
And this brings us to the reality of gladiatorial combat, which was so far removed from the idealized fantasy of equal skill and honor.
Right.
The sources confirm that these contests were meticulously rigged before they even started. They were engineered for maximum cruelty and suspense through intentional imbalance.
Slaughter, disguised as sport. We know that prisoners and criminals were often just shoved into the arena, sometimes dressed as clowns,
Yes.
handed wooden swords, and then sent against seasoned fighters, the secutors or murmillos, who had years of training.
The outcome was predetermined, but the process, the journey to that outcome, had to be excruciatingly entertaining. It provided a clear visual lesson: challenge Rome, and this is your fate.
So they cheered as wooden swords splintered against steel. It was a public execution dressed up as a competition where the favorite was guaranteed to win.
Every time.
And the tools of the trade, The specialized armor, the weaponry, they reveal the depth of this engineered cruelty, don't they?
Huh.
They weren't designed purely for protection or military effectiveness.
Absolutely not. The design choices were optimized to inflict psychological pain and to maximize the audience's emotional investment.
Let's talk about the armor.
Okay, take the helmets. Some were so heavy that by the 15th minute of combat, a fighter's neck muscles were failing. Just raising your head became agony.
And others were designed to impair vision.
Yes, some helmets narrowed vision so severely, sometimes just a small slit, that the fighter stumbled around half-blind. This heightened the peril, and it also made them look ridiculous and desperate, which the audience loved. The armor was less a defense and more a portable punishment.
The classic pairing of the Roturius and the Secutor illustrates this intentional imbalance perfectly. It seems designed entirely to amplify frustration and suspense.
It is the perfect example. The Roturius, the net man, was very lightly armored. He relied on speed and misdirection, using only a net and a trident, a fisherman's weapon.
His vulnerability was the whole point.
It was meant to inspire a kind of desperate heroism or, more often, abject failure.
And his opponent, the Secutor, was nicknamed the Pursuer.
And his helmet was specifically designed to counter the Roturius. It was smooth, rounded, and often lacked eye holes in the usual place, forcing him to keep his gaze locked forward. This heavy design was intended to perfectly deflect the Roturius's net.
So his primary weapon was almost useless from the start.
The tactical disadvantage was inherent in the design. The Secutor's lack of peripheral vision meant he had to constantly turn his heavy head, which provided a fleeting window for the Roturius. But the net, which was meant to entangle, would typically just slip harmlessly off the polished bronze helmet.
So the combat was engineered to create suspense based on this tactical frustration.
Exactly. The audience watched the netman desperately trying to land a blow, knowing the odds were stacked so heavily against him. And this agonizing process was precisely what kept the audience betting and cheering. They needed that uncertainty, even if death was virtually assured.
They needed to feel like they might witness a miracle, even though Rome had already rigged the board. And this need for sophisticated cruelty led directly into the ultimate theatrical expression of death.
The highest form of spectacle was always the midday execution, the Damnatio ad Bestias, and it was strategically scheduled. Midday, right before the audience left for lunch, and before the premier gladiatorial bouts of the afternoon.
So it was a transition point, from sport to pure execution theater. The victims, criminals, slaves, prisoners of war, were deemed ignobles, unworthy of the dignity of a quick death.
So they were tied to stakes or pillars and then torn apart by animals that had been trained to kill anything that moved.
And Seneca's observation here becomes critical again. He saw spectators eating their lunch while this happened.
It was execution as a systematic moral lesson, but it was also a calculated effort to erode empathy. And the punishment was often tailored to the crime, creating these morality plays written in real blood.
Can you give us some examples of that tailoring? How did they match the crime to the execution?
Well, if a man was found guilty of arson, he was sometimes wrapped in a pitch-soaked tunic and then set on fire in the arena.
Horrific.
If he was convicted of killing his father parricide, he might be put into a sack with venomous snakes before being drowned. Thieves were sometimes tied up and torn apart by wolves or wild dogs.
The goal was to create this clear, visible narrative. Challenge the order of the empire, and your death will be poetic, in the most grotesque sense of the word.
And the ultimate achievement of this was training citizens to associate suffering with normalcy, to normalize watching a fellow human being consumed while they consumed a sandwich.
And the uncertainty of the animal's attack. Whether the lion was starved or sated, whether it would toy with its prey or strike fast, that was crucial for keeping the audience engaged, even during their meal break.
But Rome wasn't content with just simple execution. They elevated it by merging it with their cultural heritage. They wanted victims to perform their own demise in scenes drawn from mythology,
which guaranteed that virtue or beauty provided no protection. This perversion of myth was a powerful act of imperial dominance.
The story of the broken Orpheus, which Martial documented, is perhaps the most heartbreaking illustration of this cultural vandalism.
So the myth of Orpheus is that his music could charm even wild beasts.
Exactly. So they took a prisoner, perhaps one chosen because he had a good singing voice, and they dressed him in the robes of the mythical musician. He was placed in an arena setting that was decorated with trees and rocks to look like a forest, and the prisoner began to sing, attempting to replicate this famous scene.
And what happened?
Martial recorded the brutal irony. A large, starved bear immediately charged out and mauled him to death.
So the cruelty wasn't just the death.
No, the cruelty was the immediate violent inversion of the myth. It was the guarantee that art did not matter, that beauty provided no shelter, and that Rome's version of the story always ended with a body on the sand. They weren't just killing a man, they were demonstrating control over culture and meaning itself.
That psychological layer is just chilling. He showed that even hope and creativity were subject to Rome's brutal narrative. And we see a similar theme in the Icarus's false spectacle.
Exactly. A prisoner was forced to play Daedalus, the craftsman who built wings for himself and his son Icarus. The prisoner was given these crude wings of sticks and cloth and was hoisted high above the arena floor.
So for a fleeting moment, there was the illusion of escape.
An illusion of escape and ingenuity. And then he was released, plummeting toward waiting beasts. Martial quipped that the man must have wished for real feathers.
So the audience understood the morbid joke was the cruelty of watching a man's last few seconds of hope turn into sheer terror before impact. That is the perfect distillation of the spectacle's psychological goal.
And this brings us back to the most grotesque examples. Back to the Pasiphae reenactment and to Tertullian's records of women victims. Tertullian recorded that female prisoners were sometimes dressed as priestesses or mythological figures, violated in front of the crowd, and then killed.
The message was clear. No violation, physical or moral, was too extreme for Rome's arena. They demonstrated absolute authority over life itself. You mentioned records of the execution of pregnant women, proving control even over the unborn.
Yes, mythology just became a backdrop for bureaucratic cruelty, twisted and inverted to ensure the ending was always inevitable death and humiliation.
So once they exhausted the possibilities on land, Rome moved to water, pushing the boundaries of engineering and spectacle with the Naumachia, the mock naval battles.
This required truly insane engineering feats. I mean, you're bringing the ocean where there is no ocean. Julius Caesar was the first to do it in 46 BC. He dug an enormous basin near the Tiber River, filled it with water, and forced thousands of captives to fight to the death as rival fleets.
The logistical difficulty of that, moving and maintaining that volume of water, it must have required infrastructure funded like a major military campaign.
It did, and the participants were condemned to death regardless of the outcome. The winner of Naumachia was simply the last man standing, only to be executed moments later anyway.
And this scale escalated rapidly. Emperor Augustus created a basin that was nearly 2,000 feet long, fed by a custom aqueduct built specifically just to keep it filled for one event.
Cruelty had become an engineering project. Death had become infrastructure.
But Claudius takes the prize for sheer scale in 52 AD.
He does. He didn't just dig a basin. He drained an entire body of Water Lake Fucina to stage a massive event involving thousands of fighters.
That's unbelievable.
It took 30,000 men working for 11 years just to drain the lake, all for a single deadly performance. It's hard to reconcile the sophistication required to move a lake with the sheer barbarity of the event itself. It's engineering brilliance dedicated entirely to mass murder.
And it was from those massive, doomed water battles that one of the most famous and chilling phrases in history originated.
Morituri salutant.
When those thousands of captives were led before Claudius, they offered that greeting that became the standard farewell for all gladiators. Those who are about to die salute you. A chilling acknowledgement of their fate before being killed for entertainment.
As the empire aged, instability grew, resources dwindled, the need for distraction escalated.
So the later emperors, instead of scaling back, they escalated the spectacles to maintain control. They crossed every remaining moral line. This is where the games descend into genuine, unhinged sadism.
This escalation was driven by pure desperation. As political center weakened, the spectacle had to grow louder and more shocking to distract the restless populace. And this is when we see the darkest innovations and the complete breakdown of any remaining rules.
We see the introduction of women into combat.
Yes. Women were forced to fight, sometimes naked, sometimes against dwarfs or animals. Juvenal, the satirist, he mocked them. But the historical records are clear. They fought, they died. Gender was no shield. The spectacle ensured that absolutely no one was beyond Rome's hunger.
And we encounter the introduction of fire as a systematic execution tool. Tertullian described prisoners dressed in pitch-soaked shirts and set ablaze during the midday hours, the living torches.
And this was not quick. Fire doesn't kill quickly. The body endured burning and screaming until shock finally intervened, all staged while vendors sold wine and snacks in the stands.
The use of crucifixion, which was adopted from conquered territories, was also imported into the arena itself.
Yes, men and women were nailed to timber, hoisted high, and left to die slowly over hours, sometimes days, from dehydration, shock, and asphyxiation. The agony was continuous, inescapable, and the audience watched the breaking of the human spirit as entertainment.
Crucifixion was optimized for protracted suffering.
It was. When hoisted, the weight of the body makes breathing increasingly difficult until the lungs can no longer draw air. Death becomes a slow, suffocating collapse observed by tens of thousands.
The ultimate height of imperial narcissism, however, has to be Emperor Commodus. He personified this descent into madness.
He absolutely did. He entered the Colosseum 735 times, dressed as Hercules with his club and lion skin.
He understood that the throne alone wasn't enough. The emperor had to perform his own divinity.
He claimed to be the reincarnation of Hercules, and the absurdity of his performances is detailed extensively by the historian Cassius Dio, who was a senator during Commodus's reign.
So what were these victories really like? We know they were rigged.
Rigged doesn't even begin to cover it. Commodus would slaughter hundreds of animals, but only those that were crippled beforehand. Blind lions, hamstrung bears, arthritic elephants. They couldn't fight back.
And he also fought gladiators.
But only those armed with wooden swords or men who were explicitly ordered to throw the matches and offer him their necks in a display of subservience. Losing was impossible for him. Applause was compulsory.
And this vanity came at a massive financial cost.
Cassius Dio recorded that each of Commodus's fake victories cost the treasury a staggering 1 million sesterces. He was effectively bankrupting the state to pay people to watch him play-act combat, mutilating crippled animals, and rewriting history to validate his self-proclaimed heroism.
This financial drain really highlights how the arms race of spectacle directly led to economic ruin.
Absolutely.
Let's deep dive into some of the specific sadistic innovations, because this reveals the ingenuity that was applied purely to maximizing psychological torture over mere killing efficiency.
We're talking about optimization for audience participation in psychological decline. The goal was to prolong the agony and maximize the visibility of primal failure. The tunica molesta, the burning shirt soaked in pitch we discussed, is a perfect example of this.
So how was the cruelty of that design optimized?
The cruelty was exquisite because the shirt was designed to offer the illusion of escape. It was often loose enough that a prisoner might technically be able to slip out of it.
But they couldn't.
No. As they were burning alive, they stumbled across the sand, screaming, struggling, reducing themselves to sheer primal survival instinct in a futile attempt to shed the cloth that was consuming them. The audience watched the complete, desperate failure of the human will to survive, which provided prolonged, intense entertainment.
Then there was the concept of sine qua combats without discharge or without mercy.
Right. In regular bouts, the crowd or the emperor could grant missio or mercy. But here, mercy was impossible. Both combatants entered the arena knowing that only one would leave alive,
Which guaranteed desperation in feral combat.
it stripped away any last pretense of sport or honor. It was designed to produce the maximum despair possible, changing the dynamic of the fight from a competition to an execution where the victim was forced to kill another victim just to temporarily survive.
The Asiatic method seems designed purely for protracted psychological torture and observation, extending the suffering over days.
It was. It was imported from conquered territories. The victim would be tied up, sometimes staked out in the sun, and left for days as carnivorous insects were introduced or their wounds were deliberately contaminated. The duration of the suffering was the point, allowing the audience to observe the slow collapse of the human body and mind as insects and exposure slowly consumed living tissue.
But perhaps the ultimate psychological cruelty was turning the family against itself.
Yes, forcing family members to fight, a father against his son or a brother against a brother. The spectacle ensured that the survivor, who had just murdered their loved one for the amusement of 50,000 strangers, had to live with that guilt.
Rome understood that sometimes the crueler death is survival.
Survival, combined with the knowledge of having performed the unthinkable for public entertainment. The survivor became a permanent advertisement of Rome's power to destroy all personal bonds.
The sheer catalog of these specialized cruelties is exhaustive pygmies forced to ride ostriches, prisoners coated in honey to attract stinging insects. The common theme was always the same: maximizing suffering and guaranteeing the psychological destruction of the victims before their physical death.
And the accumulated toll of this system was, well, it was massive. The empire paid the ultimate price for its industrialized sadism. And we can analyze that along three main fronts: economic, cultural, and spiritual.
Economically, we've touched upon the cost. Emperors bankrupt in the treasury, chasing bigger and bigger spectacles, engaging in an endless arms race of showmanship to outshine their predecessors, like Commodus.
Right. Resources flowed into the sand while infrastructure crumbled. Funds that should have gone to maintaining the armies and the roads were diverted to capture rare animals and flood arenas. Rome was literally spending itself into vulnerability, one spectacle at a time.
The extravagance of the games was meant to signal confidence, but underneath, the foundation was dissolving due to resource mismanagement.
And culturally, the focus shifted entirely from civic virtue to cheap distraction. Juvenal's famous phrase, panem et circenses, bread and circuses, captured the essence of this decline.
It described citizens who once honored discipline, civic duty, and military prowess, but were now just demanding cheap food and endless distraction.
The obsession with spectacle betrayed how far Rome had drifted from its disciplined republican roots. The public sphere became a place for the passive consumption of state-sponsored violence rather than active political participation.
And finally, the spiritual death. Tertullian, watching the mass executions of Christians in the arenas, he saw this very clearly.
He called the games the seeds of cruelty. He argued that an empire that was cheering injustice as sport had already signed its own death warrant. The violence poisoned daily life, the capacity for empathy shrank, and citizens became crueler and more arbitrary in their ordinary dealings because they had been trained to view human suffering as amusement.
The moral foundation had dissolved long before the military borders collapsed.
Exactly. By the 5th century, the Colosseum stood mostly hollow. The roars had stopped. The question wasn't whether the games caused Rome's fall,
But whether they were the final visible symptom of a spiritual death that had preceded it.
if we synthesize what we've learned across these sources, from the logistical complexity of the supply chain and the engineering brilliance of the Naumachia, to the psychological torture of the Cynomycenae fights and the perversion of myth, we see that Rome's arenas were never about simple entertainment.
No. They were sophisticated machines of psychological and political control. They shaped how citizens thought, how they obeyed, and how they laughed. They made imperial power look eternal and resistance look impossible.
The spectacle wasn't merely a reflection of Roman society. It was a powerful tool used to forge compliance, to train the audience in obedience through shared complicity and atrocity.
And the lingering question carved into those ruins is, well, it's profound. We can admire the stone, the engineering, the history, but it is all built on rehearsed cruelty that became normalized over centuries.
An empire that built its entertainment on the degradation and consumption of human life and vanishing species ultimately consumed itself.
Rome's arenas taught its citizens a terrifying ultimate lesson, that no one is protected, not the powerful, not the weak, and as the records of the execution of women and forcing families to fight show, not even the fundamental bonds of humanity. That fear, that knowledge of absolute vulnerability before the state was the true price of admission.
The moral price paid by Rome for consuming violence as entertainment was its own societal collapse, a spiritual death enacted daily in the sand.
And so we leave you with this final provocative thought. We watch different civilizations learn this same lesson in real time, through different mediums and with different spectacles. What modern forms of spectacle, whether in media, global politics, or digital entertainment, serve as similar function of control and distraction? And what price are contemporary societies unknowingly paying for consuming violence and degradation, normalized and packaged, for their amusement? Something to consider the next time you hear a collective roar, even if it's coming from your own living room.